With the help of the Almighty, I pray to the Almighty to bestow upon me His truth, His wisdom, that I may be worthy of conveying His message and so sanctify His name. My name is Rabbi Yisroel Dovid Weiss from Newark, Karta, Jews United Against Zionism. Excuse me. We're here as representatives, with the help of the Almighty, of Jewish people around the world, representing the true picture of what Judaism is, and our pain, our suffering, our hurt about what is being done in our name. We're here about to speak about the ideology of Zionism and the state of Israel, which shouldn't be say it in the same breath as Judaism. It's totally antithetical, it's contradictory, but we're going to be discussing this with God's help. First, I'd like to thank the SJP, the Students for Justice in Palestine, somebody who's I've had met and dealt with, a very friendly guy, Orji, and now had the honor of meeting Dylan, the Vice President, and all the ones who are involved here, and all the students who took your precious time to come to listen. I really appreciate it. And I hope with God's help it'll be worthy of your time. It's something which is a subject which affects all of us. It affects the world. And not knowing this issue clearly results that people are accused of being anti-Semitic when you want to speak up of your hurt for the people of Palestine. If you are Palestinian, to speak up your pain that just shouts from within your hearts, that just speaks for itself, and you're talking about the suffering of your brothers and sisters, the people of Palestine. And when you speak up right away, you have to apologize, and it seems like people, you're guilty until proven innocent, that you're anti-Semitic, and that's really unacceptable. And it's unacceptable because, first of all, it's totally not true. And that's what we're here to speak about with God's help, amongst a few other issues. And this, as I say, is critical to understand, so people can speak up for what is godly, what is truth, what is right, what is justice. And with God's help, your college students, with God's help, the future leaders, with God's help, that maybe, we hope it'll happen this week still, but we hope that with God's help, you'll be able to help to be a catalyst to bring a freedom of Palestine, free of this occupation entirely. But like I say, I hope that it'll happen this week still. So, but whatever it is, it'll just be a nice course in knowledge. With God, we'll start. First of all, Judaism. Let me just explain briefly. Judaism is a religion. It's a religion of 3,000 years. Around 3,000 years ago, Moses stood on Mount Sinai and made a covenant. The Jewish people, he represented the Jewish people, and they made a covenant. There was over 1 million Jews then. And they made a covenant with God to be subservient to God, to accept the laws of the Torah, 613 commandments, the 5 books of Moses, and the rest of the Torah, which is the oral law that explains all that. But he accepted that on Mount Sinai. And that is what we practice till today. We're not allowed to sway even an iota. We're not allowed to add. We're not allowed to subtract. This is the Judaism that was given on Mount Sinai, and it's passed down from generation to generation. And basically, again, it means to be subservient to God, accept that there's one God on the world, and we have to accept His laws. At the same time, the Almighty commanded all the nations to accept that Moses went to Mount Sinai, brought the Torah from God, and that it commanded every human being to serve God. We don't consider somebody who's not Jewish they're a sinner because of that. The person doesn't have to be Jewish to serve God, and they will inherit, as the words of the prophet Elijah says, you will inherit the world to come if you just as you keep the commandments that are given to every human being, which is to believe in one God. That in the Torah it states, God told Moses and written in the Torah that you should believe in one God, not to commit adultery, not to kill, not to steal, not to serve idols, to have a court system in whatever land you're residing, and not to eat from an animal when it's still shaking. The 6 commandments. Basically, we believe in one God and you will inherit the world to come. But anyway, this covenant that we made was 3,000 years old, and it's what we are practicing till today. Zionism is a political movement. It's a nationalist movement that started a mere 100-odd years, and it was made by mostly non-religious Jews. Clearly, they weren't ashamed of that fact. They were Jews who rebelled against the whole concept of Judaism. It didn't start from a vacuum. They actually came from, most of them were children and grandchildren of Reform Judaism, which was a movement that started like 50 years ago to reform, to change Judaism. In other words, we believe Judaism, and we gave our lives for throughout our generations, is that we have a covenant with God. Well, Reform started 200 odd years ago. It was a movement that said, Moses wrote a book, and we don't have to follow that. You can pick and choose what you want. They're going to reform the religion. And they stopped keeping the 10 Commandments, the Sabbath, and so forth and so on. Most of the Zionists were children and grandchildren of this movement. So they were a movement that didn't feel obligated, they didn't have any problem with breaching any laws of the Torah. They pick and choose what's convenient. And they decided that this concept of reform, to change Judaism in order that you should be able to, the main issue of reform was that you should be able to assimilate and feel comfortable when you you're living in Germany, you're living where they were living, you should feel comfortable amongst the other people around the world, their other friends and neighbors that they're living with, that they shouldn't be looked down as a second-class citizen. So they decided to assimilate, and that was basically what reform was. And they started dressing, even in the synagogues, they started using concepts of churches with an organ, with the dressing of the rabbis, the reverend. That's what was reform. And Zionism came along, and they said, hey, this is not working for us, this reform, because there was still anti-Semitism. We know that everything is from God, and that when we suffer, we know it's to be introspective, and God expects of us to look into our deeds and see why God is punishing somebody. I mean, just a broad example, just that you have in Germany, the root of assimilation, of reform, where they said they'll become like their neighbors, they'll drop their Jewish garb, and they'll become that you won't recognize them from any other non-Jew, and they said, and that will protect them. And how ironic, but we know it's from God. Where did Hitler come from? That's where it started. Where they assimilated the most, where they were the most cultured, with doctors and lawyers and everything else that required that you should be respected amongst the high society in Germany. And that's where Hitler didn't ask them, are you a practicing Jew? Your grandmother is a Jew, your grandfather's a Jew, and they threw them into the gas chambers. So we see it's from God. So you see that if you believe in God, you see God's hand in everything. But basically, the reform movement started 250 years ago, but there was many actions of open anti-Semitism that happened in these societies. So this group of people, of Zionists, they decided, the solution is that we should make our own country, our own state, we'll have our own land, and we'll be safe that way. We're going to protect ourselves. So that's a Zionism. It's a nationalist movement. It's a political movement. We'll have our own country, our own safety. So it's a new movement. It's nothing to do with this subservience to God. It's totally another concept. It's not only another concept, it's contradictory, because God wants of us that and requires of us that we should be loyal citizens in every land, that we're forbidden to go and create our own nationhood. Our issue is to be people of the book, to be practicing the Torah, scholars, and so forth. This concept of nationalism is antithetical to Judaism. I'll explain a little more about that issue. But basically, the Zionist is a new movement. Again, Judaism is 3,000 years, Zionism is 100-odd years. So it's in and of itself, the whole thing, it's a new movement. It's a nationalist movement. It's a movement of a material concept, a material movement, while Judaism is spiritual, contradictory, unacceptable, and it just doesn't jive. There's more than that. The reason there's a commandment we have that we're not allowed to make our own state. it's since 3,000 years when we 3,000 years ago when we accepted the Torah, we were told by God, we were commanded that we have to go into the Holy Land. The Jews were in Sinai, in the Midbar, in the wilderness, and they were commanded to go in. In fact, there were people who actually converted to Judaism out of Egypt, and they were reluctant to go in, and because of that the Jews were punished and they had to wander in the wilderness because they didn't accept God's command, and they had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. But afterwards they went in because it was God's command. But they were required to be in a high level of spirituality, of holiness. And the land, we call it the Holy Land, that it's holy. It has, we believe it's metaphorically speaking, like the garden of God. So it's a very special place, and we have to be on a higher level than we have to be in the rest of the world, practicing our this subservience to God. If not, we were warned by God, we will be sent into exile. That means we will be the land will reject us. It says many times in the Torah, the land itself will reject you if you're not on par, you're not as you're supposed to be. It's like a body is very sensitive. If they make a transplant, they have to give medication constantly that the body should not reject it. The Holy Land is sensitive to people who are not on the proper level of holiness. So therefore, it happened 2,000 years ago. The Jews went in eventually to the Holy Land. They went in as God's command. Then, and it happened through miraculous happenings. I don't know if you're aware, like the walls of Jericho sunk in. They walked 7 times. Joshua, the prophet, walked around the walls of Jericho, and they sunk in because it was God's will, and it happened through miraculous happenings. The ones who were living there, if they decided not to worship idols, they were allowed to stay. But that's part of the history of Judaism, and I'm not going to delve into all of that. But one thing was, we were warned by the prophets, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, that we will be rejected from the land if we're not going to be on this high level. We were warned many times. 2,000 years ago, the Jews were sent into exile with the destruction of the temple. We were then put under oath by God that we're not allowed to return en masse. That's 2,000 years ago. So we are not since then allowed to return as a nation to the Holy Land. We're not allowed to. There's 3 oaths involved here. God put us under 3 oaths, and it's a King Solomon's prophecy in Shir Hashirim, the Song of Songs, a book of King Solomon. It's considered the highest prophecy. And he said the Jews were warned not to return en masse, in large numbers, to create a nationalism. And secondly, not to rebel against any nation. We have to be loyal citizens in every country we reside. It means, in other words, if I'm a United States citizen and I'm not happy with my president or something, I still have to deal with respect. Just as Moses spoke to the Pharaoh in Egypt, even though they were enslaving the Jews, he had to speak to him with respect and so forth. We're not allowed to break the laws of the Torah, but we have to approach with respect. We have to pray for the well-being of the land where we reside. Even if they tax the Jews 10 times as much they do other people, and we can plead, we can, and try to have them change their opinion about the Jews and so forth. But we're not allowed to rebel against any nation. That's a stringent requirement of Judaism, and it says it in the books of Daniel speaks about that the king commanded Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, 3 prophets, that they should bow down to worship idols, and they said no. They said when it comes to taxation, you are our king. When it comes to serving God, you and the dog are the same. So they told them, in other words, we'll listen to you, we'll pay your taxes, we'll do. But when it comes to this, to serving God, you want to have us breach the laws of the Torah, we can't. So basically, we are under exile for 2,000 years. We went through many, many trials and tribulations, hardships, the Crusades, the Inquisition, and so forth, where they burnt the Jews at the stake. The history is there for anybody to see. You can go to Italy, you can go to Portugal, you can see the towns, the cities, every place Jews lived. Even in England, there's York. I went to York, I don't know, here's New York, it's named after York, I'm sure. Right in the center, there's a castle. It's a big castle on top of a big mound, and there's a big sign on the steps going up there, which says here, I don't know how many thousands of Jews were murdered. I think thousands of Jews, or hundreds certainly, but I think thousands. The Jews we used to pay for protection from the whoever it was, I don't know how it was referred to, the Lord in that time of that area, and then like a bunch of people came to attack them, so they ran up to this castle for protection, and they weren't protected, and they were all killed. They had the choice of either converting to Christianity or they'll be burnt. And they were all burnt to kill. The place is still there. It's York in England. Basically, so there's three oaths: not to rebel against nations, not to return en masse to the Holy Land, and not to make any attempt to end exile. Because 2,000 years ago, because we were not on this level of spirituality to remain in the Holy Land as a nation, we were dispersed amongst the nations, and we are with the destruction of the temple, we were sent enslaved in many lands, and we are not allowed to make any attempt to end this exile. This was accepted for 2,000 years. So we went through the Crusades, the Inquisition. We had many opportunities that Jews were able to buy a piece of land, but we never did it because we asked our rabbis, who were the authorities, who were the leaders of the Jewish community, because we're a religion. Who do you turn to? The rabbis. They're the leaders of the community. And they all stated clearly, they all told us patience. God is totally compassionate. He sees Jewish suffering. He sees what you're suffering, but the time is not for you to leave exile. So you must remain. Don't rebel against nations. So what we did is, again, we pleaded with leaders and that they should let us live in peace. If not, we had to pick up our stick and the bundle and walk and go to another land. But we never rebelled against nations. Zionism came along and they decided that enough is enough, because they have no compunctions, they have no moral ruling that tells them that they're not allowed to leave, so they'll do what they feel is convenient, what is something that they can fulfill their craving. So they decided they want a state. They're going to have a land. This is going to be the solution. They're going to do it. The rabbis all stood in opposition. We put out a book about that. The rabbis speak out. It's a compilation of rabbis around the world. Almost the entire Jewish populace around the world, they ostracized the ones who made this movement, who condoned and who started to push this movement of leaving exile, of creating our own state, because it's unacceptable. This is clear. The Torah states clearly we are in exile. And every Jew in his prayers beseeches God. And anybody, today it's not a problem, you go on the internet and you find that in every, you can look at the translation of Jewish prayers. All our prayers, we speak about eventually we will return to the Holy Land. Now let me explain what the basics of Judaism is, that our craving, our want to return to the Holy Land, what it means, the future of what Judaism requires. We believe we're in exile, and we believe that we will return. But the returning, first of all, is not because we're craving for a piece of land, to have just property, because that's not what we are. We had a closeness to God. The Holy Land was something that was holy. What does holy mean? It's a spiritual thing, that we should be close to God. King Solomon built a temple. We were close to God. By not being on that proper level, we were dispersed. We were sent out of the land. We were banished from the land as a nation. What we crave is that closeness to God. The solution is, the eventuality is that we believe one day the Almighty will, with His compassion, end this decree of exile, and we will all return to the Holy Land, where God will build a temple Himself without any human intervention. Now we believe it's not only going to be Jews serving God, it's all the world together will come together, and there's verses in that says all the nations will come together and serve God in harmony. So we in our 2,000 years of exile, we were living in Muslim lands, we were living in Christian lands, and we are very thankful. We will never forget that when the Crusades were, the Inquisition, Jews were embraced and taken in and given a safe haven in the Muslim lands. This is a fact of history. Now, why didn't the Muslims look at us as a threat? First of all, the Jews were also living in Palestine as individuals. The decree of exile does not forbid Jews to live there as individuals, so there were Jews living there. Why were we not deemed a threat in the Muslim lands? Because anybody who studies the laws of the Torah, what I'm explaining, the basics of Judaism, is that we don't believe one day we're going to take up arms and go to the people and throw them out. It says all the nations will come up and serve God. We believe that it will be a spiritual happening where everybody's going to recognize one God. There won't be the concept of atheism. The people will stop denying the existence of God, and everybody will serve God together and serve Him. Who will build the temple? God will build the temple. That's our belief. So take it or leave it. We're not asking anybody to become Jewish. We're not asking anybody to believe this thing. As our exilic existence right now, we just have to serve God. Keep the Sabbath. Don't steal. Don't kill. emulate God. Just as God is compassionate, you should be compassionate. So the existence of Judaism and of what it means to be a Jew, is to be kind, to do good deeds, to serve God, emulate God, and to be a people of the book. What will the future bring? It's in our prayers. We crave, we yearn for that day when the Almighty will, with His compassion, end the exile. Everybody will go up together and serve God in harmony. This was not a threat for the Muslim leaders. They were scholars. The Muslim leaders understood the words of the Torah. It's written in Arabic also. Everybody saw what Judaism is. Simply, we pray to God that we are trying, the purpose of our lives is to sanctify God's name with everything that we do, but the pinnacle of that will be when God will bring us all together and all humanity will serve us. So that's what it says in our prayers. The day will come. Look at the end of the morning prayers, the evening prayers, the day. Every single prayer starts with that. Adon Olam. God is the master of the universe. And we end, there will come a day when God Himself will be king over the whole world. We don't pray that we should have for this piece of land. We are praying for this revelation of God. That's what Judaism is, a spiritual concept. Yes, we believe we will return. We don't apologize for that. But the return will be with the will of all humanity and the will of the people who are living there. And it won't be a fight. It says all the nations will join arms. Zionism lost what it means to be a Jew. They have the shell. They still have the name Jew, and they were living in Europe, and they made these Reform temples, so many of them were from Reform, or whatever, so they just had the concept of that we'll be proud. The Christian has his Pope and his priest, and they're going to have they're not going to be second class, so they built these tremendous temples, they called them. Instead of synagogues, temples, usually they're called the temples, and they had an organ just as, expensive as the ones in the church, and they had so forth and so on, and they're just missing the whole inside. They have the shell of Judaism, but they're a Jew and a proud Jew, they're cultured, they're learned, but they're missing what it means to be a Jew. It's just the facade they're using. So they call themselves Jews, but they're missing the whole concept. Judaism is one thing, subservience to God, to keep the Sabbath, keep the 10 Commandments. Isn't that simple enough? I mean, what does it mean if you can't keep the 10 Commandments? You can drive on the Sabbath, you can eat non-kosher, it's missing. You're obviously missing. If this is what we gave our lives throughout history to keep the Torah, what does that mean? It's the laws of the Torah. So something is wrong. This is, and actually it was forbidden. The rabbis in Europe issued a fatwa when Reform started, like the greatest leaders of Europe, of the Jewish community, issued a fatwa that we're not even allowed to go into a Reform temple, even do good deeds with them, join them in actions. Because why? Because they're totally rebelling against God and what it means to be a Jew. So that's the difference between Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox means that we comply and we are subservient to the laws of the Torah. Reform went over the deep end, so a movement started called conservative Judaism. Conservatives said that, Reform is just so way out that they're going to be a little more conservative, but it's not upholding the law to the letter of the law. Judaism requires of us that it's the words of God. You can't change it. So that is what Orthodoxy in Europe opposed the Reform, and when Zionism came, they opposed it totally, tooth and nail. They stood up the rabbis. We have the words of the leading rabbis around the world. Each one in their style said that this is unacceptable. Of course, I left out one of the, I spoke about this concept that we're not allowed to have, Judaism doesn't mean nationalism or to have a piece of land, which Zionism decided they want to be. But that was talking even if the land was uninhabited. If it would have been a land without a people, it would have been an empty, uninhabited land, like they were claiming that Palestine is a land without a people, for a people without a land. But if that would have been true, it's still, our rabbis would have opposed it because we are in exile, because it's godly decreed. But that is that's a tragic, that's part of the Nakba, that's a tragic falsehood, because the land was not an empty land. It was a land that was inhabited. The majority were Muslim. Then there was a Christian community as the second largest community, and there was a Jewish, a respectable, distinguished Jewish community that was living there. Mainly was the elite of Jewish society around the world. Old rabbis would go and retire and go there through the ages, not from business. It was a very poor place to live, but they would go and live there to live out their lives in holiness. As I mentioned earlier, we're forbidden to return en masse as a nation, but as individuals we could live there. So Jews lived there all throughout the ages, and it was the elite, the Ivy League of Judaism were living there. This community was there only to serve God, not with aspiring to take over the land, but they were the smallest community of the three, between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And they lived in the same courtyards. I have many people who join us a lot of times in our demonstrations for Palestine who are children and grandchildren. My son married a woman who's a granddaughter of one of the greatest outspoken fighters against Zionism. Fighters, I don't mean with a gun, but they were out there and demonstrating, and his name was Rabbi Cohen of blessed memory, and he lived in Palestine. He used to tell me, him and his son, who passed away also a few years ago, used to talk to me how they used to live in the old city, in Al-Quds, in the old city. They used to live in the same courtyards. I've got pictures of these things. They would sit together. They would a Jew, and they would live, and they would babysit each other's children, because there was a distinct difference of religion. Because we're talking about God-fearing Jews who upheld every letter of the law of the Torah, and there were Muslims who were God-fearing. They were Muslim, following their religion, but so they didn't try to make compromises in their religion. That wasn't the interfaith issue, that you're going to interfaith. We're going to make compromises. No, what meant they lived together in the same courtyards. When the Jew went to the synagogue and the women had to go on Yom Kippur or whatever, they would babysit their children. They entrusted their children with their most precious object, and they would live together in the same courtyards. And I've heard it from, as I say, many, many people who are first-hand witness to that, of that coexistence, that even though they had a distinctly different religion, it was never a problem of coexisting. The Jews and the Muslims, they lived together, because the idea is this nothing to do with a religious conflict. The concept of occupying, of taking over the land of Palestine, had nothing to do because they're Jews who decided, oh, God commanded us to take over the land. On the contrary, they were living there for hundreds of years, the Jewish people, under the Ottoman Empire. They were very happy to live there as such, and they had no problem. They didn't aspire to take over the land. Zionism is a concept that was a transformation from religion to nationalism. It's a totally different thing. It shouldn't be referred to as Judaism at all. That's scandalous. That's really stealing another's name. It's simple as that, and it's unacceptable. But that's what they decided to give themselves, to use the name Judaism as to legitimize this concept of what they're going to do, of occupying and taking over the land. So in its essence, again, Judaism is to serve God. Zionism is the transformation to nationalism. Judaism tells us that we're not allowed to have our own sovereignty, even 1 inch of sovereignty. And by the way, not even in Palestine, but we're not allowed to, since the decree of exile, to have any sovereignty any part of the world. Zionism just totally disregards that. But on top of that, being that Zionism decided to make their homeland in Palestine, now they're going into a land that was the majority Muslims, and then the Christians and the Jewish community, and they decided they're going to create their homeland over there. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, in the Torah it says you're not allowed to steal, you're not allowed to kill. I mean, that's part of the basics of Torah. But again, they're not obligated by that according to their mindset. But there's another issue here. When they decided to do this, they really, if you would look at history, they weren't even interested in going to Palestine, because Palestine is not the greatest land at that time, especially today, as everything works with computers and everything, and it's not the industrial generation, right? So now it has to do with technical knowledge and all that. So, in those days, you looked for a land that was productive, to be able to sow the land and be able to produce. So that's what you even see the old pictures of the Zionists with shovels. I don't know if you ever seen these pictures, that they're tilling the land, because you had to look for a productive way. So they wanted to go to Uganda, they wanted to create their homeland, and then Patagonia. And this is a fact, these are things that they try to do. But they decided that you need a massive amount of support money you need in order to be able to create a homeland. It doesn't work like that. It's a tremendous undertaking, and the only way they'll be able to do that is they'll get support from nations around the world. Now, so they came with the solution. They'll turn to Palestine. Now, Palestine, they'll able to very simply be able to turn to the Christian evangelist Christians, Christians around the world who believe that it was the children of Israel and they have to return to the land of Israel, and that it's a blessing if you support such a thing. And then they could go also to the Jewish communities around the world who already reform, and most of these are ignorant. They don't even know what the Torah requires of them, and they'll turn to them and say, they'll use their emotions. They say, look, 2,000 years we were driven from land to land, and we didn't have a homeland. We don't have respect. Look, we have the opportunity. Let's return to the land. You remember, your father prayed that you should return to the land. We have the opportunity now. We'll buy that piece of land. We'll return. So let's support it. It's certainly God's will also. They put on this aura of holiness, and we'll be able to return to the Holy Land. So they decided the solution is to go to Palestine. So if they would have gone to Uganda, we would oppose them just the same, because they're breaching the oaths of God to remain in exile, a decree of God, because we were not on that level of holiness. But they compounded their crime by going to Palestine. And in Palestine, they're going and they're totally ignoring the indigenous populace over there, the Palestinian people, and that's a crime. I mean, it's a colossal crime. It's not. I mean, you have people that are living there, and the Jewish people who are living there were just. They didn't know what to say. They couldn't speak up because their voices were not heard. They did speak up. They protested. We have the writings of the rabbis in that generation. When they decided to create the state, the chief rabbi of Palestine, his name was Rabbi Dushinsky of blessed memory, and it's in the United Nations documents. He went with the delegation to there was a delegation sent from the United Nations to Palestine, and you can go on our site. The pictures are not terrific here, but you go to our site and you have the words of Rabbi Dushinsky of blessed memory in 1947. We went with a few rabbis to speak to the United Nations. It's their records, even the pictures we got from them, and I'm quoting him word for word what he said. He said, "We furthermore wish to express." I have it. We furthermore wish to express our definite opposition. I'm sorry, it's July 16th, 1947. And he said, "We furthermore wish to express our definite opposition to a Jewish state in any part of Palestine." Imagine that. "We furthermore wish to express our definite opposition to a Jewish state in any part of Palestine." In other words, regardless if it's going to affect other people, if they're going to deny because they're going to say, "Oh, it's not a Palestinian's home, it's this, it's that." It doesn't matter. We don't want this Jewish state. It's not us. And so what did the Zionists do? The Zionists, of course, we never accused them of being inefficient. So what do? They created their own rabbinate, and they have a rabbinate. And today, if you ask anybody, who's the rabbinate? And you'll right away you'll Google and you'll find the Israeli rabbinate and their chief rabbi who traipses around the world speaking in the name supposedly of Judaism. I'd like to let you know that there is a rabbinate that was existing then, that's existing now, that represents the hundreds of thousands of Jews who are anti-Zionist, who don't accept this occupation, who are living there. Here you have, in the last chief rabbi was taken up in Misparment 2002, and you have hundreds of thousands lining the streets in Jerusalem. You can go to our site and Google it. And we have constantly demonstrations there in Kikar Shabbos, it's called. We have thousands and thousands of Jews there. They're all anti-Zionist. They're living there, and they say, no, that's not what it means to be a Jew. These are interlopers. These guys are coming from the outside. They're coming from Europe, a movement called Zionism. But unfortunately, the works of Shatan, of the Satan, is that the United Nations, defying logic, defying, ironically, what they were created for. It was supposed to be created that it should be a body to give the world, around the world, democracy, that everybody should be able to live. And they decided to create something called the Jewish state, the state of Israel. It defies logic. In other words, for a certain people are going to have control over the land supposedly because of their religion. or because where they came from or something, which is unbelievable. And even if there would be only a minority there, it doesn't make sense. But the majority were Muslims, and together with the Christians were there. And how did they do that? How did they ratify that? But that's the fact. They ratified a concept of creating a so-called Jewish state. And so the Zionists went around and it got sympathy and support from the world nations to support their nationalism, a new movement that's only mere 100-odd years. Because again, you will go to the rabbinical authorities around the world, they say this is unacceptable. And they're mortified by what's happening to their Yassin. We had rabbis who were neighbors there, and again, I met them, I knew them throughout the years, and they said they were horrified. They couldn't. Their voice was stifled. Their voice was not heard. They went up, they spoke, and they were murdered. They were assassinated. We had Jews who were demonstrating from day one. We never carry guns. We're not militant. That's a fact. Even the Zionists accuse us and attack us viciously. Now, for over 70 years, and much more than 70 years, because they existed more than 70 years. They have the state, but they were there for over 100 years. And 1920s, the Zionist movement started even before, at the beginning of the 20th century. And the Jews were constantly demonstrating, and they were actually assassinated. And they would try to grab Jewish youth from the streets and take them into the Haganah before they had the Israeli IDF. Jews would come off the ships after the concentration camps, and they would also manipulate that the ships should end up in Palestine, and they would use them as cannon fodder. We have a lot of documentation of what they did. They took them, and they forcefully took them there. They didn't even know where they're going, what's happening with them. They put guns in their hands. They said these are like the Nazis. These are brothers of the Nazis. They put guns in their emaciated, half-dead people. They put them up in the front. And the ones who refused to go, they shot, they killed. We have pictures of demonstrations. Again, go to our site. The other site is Israel versus Judaism.org. Israel versus Judaism.org. I think YouTube blocked it, or YouTube blocked our site. Why? I don't know why. That was site just to document the demonstrations, the constant documentation of peaceful demonstrations where Jews are brutally attacked, beaten, arrested, because we stand on the street and we say it's unacceptable. This is not Judaism. We refuse to accept the existence of the State of Israel and their crimes. We were just discussing, somebody called me yesterday, they have a law, the IDF, because being that they're a state that's occupying, so they have to have a mandatory military service. And it's mandatory. So every boy and girl who turns 17 has to go serve. If not, you're a criminal. Now, our communities refuse to go and serve in the military. That's a fact. So because we refuse to go, they're all criminals. So they arrest them. They arrest them constantly. They put them behind bars. They force them. They put them, not only, this is psychological, they put on the army uniforms, and then they're sitting girls in prison. They called me yesterday from that. There's a girl called Little Cohen. Cohen is her name. Little, so it must be some type of a Jewish type of a name or something. It's not maybe a Sephardic. I never heard that name. Little, but anyway, Little Cohen. You can look it up. And she's just arrested. And again, they're constantly arresting girls. I think they caught her at the airport or something. Anybody who refused to serve is a criminal, and they oppress them. They beat them on the streets. Children. And simply because we refuse to accept this occupation. Now again, how are they able to justify what they're doing? Because to the world doesn't know everything, all the facts of what Judaism is. People know there's a Christian, there's a Jew. Ask somebody to explain from the world the difference between Sharia and or speak about Muslim religion, or the difference in a sheikh, an imam, or whatever. You ask somebody to explain somebody else's religion. Nobody knows what it's all about. They have some false concepts about what it's about, a lot of it, but they don't know what it's about. So Judaism, yeah, sure, there's the children of Israel and there's the land of Israel, and the Jews were oppressed, terribly oppressed, which that's a fact. Unfortunately, my grandparents were killed in Auschwitz. Most of my family was killed there. My father escaped from Hungary, and he was, thank God, ended up in America. And And that's how I'm here. But anyway, basically, but most of the family were killed. So we know suffering, but suffering is to be used as a tool to buy sympathy and to justify occupying is totally immoral and unjustifiable and unacceptable. But the fact is that they're counting on the lack of knowledge of the world communities and the power that they had till today almost of the sole control of the media, that they were able to tell the world that this is a religious conflict. This Judaism, that God promised the Jews the land of Israel, and we have a right to be there, and it's our land. I have the deed to the land, the Torah, and the Christians also believe in the Old Testament, so it's theirs. And there's a body of people who, just like the Nazis and so forth, the narrative flows very well. Just like the Nazis, you have the people in Palestine who are anti-Semitic. We've had that in history many times throughout history. So they're anti-Semitic because they don't want the Jews to settle there. We're not looking to throw them out. It was a land without a people. Was the old narrative, and they're simply anti-Semitic. And the Jews suffered enough. And people also have qualms. They have their guilt ride because many of the countries didn't accept Jews by World War II, which is a very scandal. Everybody knows about that scandal. And so therefore people want to rectify or somehow, do something that they were silent. So when the Jews suffered by Hitler, which is not so long ago, so they want to help the Jews to settle, have at least a little piece of land. And why shouldn't the Palestinians accept that? I mean, after all, it's an empty land. They're going to cultivate the land. They're doing great too. They make Nobel Prize winners and everything. So it defies logic. So it must be they're anti-Semitic. That is repulsive, unacceptable. It's tragic. It's a nekba because it's not true. It's totally false. On the contrary, Jews for hundreds and hundreds of years, when the Jews were being persecuted and killed and burnt at the stake throughout history, the Muslims took them in. And we lived in Palestine. We flourished in Palestine as Jews. And the Torah, part of the Torah requires us to be grateful, to acknowledge, and to constantly be thankful and to repay with good when good has been done. And the Muslim countries took us in 100% knowledgeable of the difference of religion. It was never an impediment of coexistence. So we lived in Palestine. We flourished there. And all of a sudden this movement who decided they have to have a nationalist home, and they decided that Palestine will be the most acceptable for them, they decided their narrative has to include that the people who are being ejected from their homes, they have to be labeled as anti-Semitic because they're not going willfully. So this is unacceptable and it's a crime. Again, we have to understand this is not a religious conflict. There's not enough words to. This has nothing to do with the difference of religion. It has to do with a fight against religion, of being subservient, of accepting justice of God. The Jewish and the Muslim people who are living in Palestine were occupied by this movement that came out of Europe called Zionism, a nationalist movement. That is what it is, that in its essence is actually built and predicated. It's the root of this is blasphemy, because they say God can protect us. We have to have a gun, and that's going to protect us. They always ridicule. I grew up as a religious Jew, and the Zionists would always ridicule. Yeah, you're looking to God to protect you. Where was God by Hitler, and so forth? In other words, they're totally openly declaring that God is weak and cannot protect us. So I mean, in actuality, you look at this, it's both the contradiction. You're saying that you're a Jewish people and you believe in a God who rules the world, and here you're saying that God is giving you to breathe and keeping you together, and here you're saying that, well, God can't take care of, can't protect you. So what it is, you have to take a gun, you have to have an Uzi, you have to have your whatever, the drones today, and all their other the machines of mass destruction what they're using. So this is all done in the name of a totally contradictory hypocrisy. In other words, it's Judaism, we're Jews, yet where was God to protect us? And they ridicule their religious Jews. And they're saying, so we have a right to take over the land. So they've occupied, the Muslims the Christians and the Jews. And the Jews pleaded. They pleaded with the ones who were in control, with the Britain at the time. They said, let us free of that. Do you know that they required the Jews to register everyone had to register under their religious leaders, and they required the Jews to register under the Zionists in the 1920s. And we had to fight tooth and nail that they should be free, that the Jews should have be allowed to not register as Zionists when it was under British control. And that's what they required of us. And the Jews stood up and demonstrated, and they fought. And they constantly being fought. Again, they demonstrated we don't have guns, but they went out on the streets. They refused to go to the army, as till today. And they get brutally beaten, and they get attacked. They get assassinated. We have pictures of many rabbis who were assassinated. In fact, maybe the first famous martyr was a Dr. Dahan. Dr. Dahan was in the 1920s. He was a diplomat from Denmark who decided to become religious. And the king of Denmark, he was such a famous, he was a poet, he was a famous diplomat, and he decided that the way to do right is to become a Zionist, to become a religious Jew is to become a Zionist. It makes sense. Because like I say, they count on the ignorance of the masses. So that he decided, it seems the utopia, the right way of serving God would be go to Palestine. So he went to Palestine, and the Zionists loved him. They were so excited because he was a very famous person, Dr. Dahan. And he went there, and he first joined the Zionists, but he was a person who was searching for the truth. And he became right away aware that the community, the religious community, was being led by anti-Zionists. And they told him, and he became very close with the chief rabbi, whose name was Rabbi Sonnenfeld. He was before that rabbi that I mentioned earlier, Rabbi Dushinsky. At that time, the chief rabbi was Rabbi Sonnenfeld. A picture of Rabbi Sonnenfeld. Just look at our site. And Rabbi Sonnenfeld was against Zionism. He went and he wrote letters in the Arabic newspapers, and we have that in the books called Traditional Torah Opposition to Zionism. He met with the king of Transjordan, and I have that picture over here. He met with the king of Transjordan. He met with them, and he pleaded with them, this is not us. We don't want to be under these Zionists. And these were the rulers of the Jewish communities. But what the Zionists came, and like I say, what they did was, they put on this facade. They're quite efficient. Like have AIPAC, they put on this facade of holiness. They used the name, the state of Israel, because Israel is Jacob in the Torah. They used the Star of David, the menorah. They don't keep the Sabbath. They breach every law of the Torah that you can think of, immorality and so forth. Everything goes on there. But they decided that for the world, they present themselves as not only the state of Israel, but the Jewish state. Netanyahu goes around insisting that it's the Jewish state. Why? Because it's very good. Because then, right away, it connotes, that means that the connotation is that if you are opposing it, you are opposing the religion Judaism. And he gets the evangelistic Christian support, which is in numbers more than the Jews. There are millions of people that support them. And they go around to the Jewish people. So a lot of Jewish people were non-religious, and they don't keep the Sabbath. They figure, well, they can still buy God by simply supporting the state of Israel. And that's what they tell them. They go around, support UJA, JNF, support all these organizations, and then you're a good Jew. So they don't keep the words of the Torah. But it doesn't matter. You're supporting JNF. You're supporting, well, I support Israel, they'll tell you. That was your covenant with God. Your covenant was to be subservient to God, not to steal, not to kill, to show gratitude for the people who assisted you. It's part of the Torah. And yet they tell them, Judaism, they have this facade, they traipse around masquerading as a Jew, and not only that, but they have the audacity to disqualify the Jews who are observing the Torah. Now you come to any country, you go to, here in New York, what could be a better example, you go to, right across, is Williamsburg, Brooklyn, right across from Manhattan, there's Williamsburg. I'm sure you all know Williamsburg here, New Jersey. Now you go, it's the largest concentration of religious Jews, and you can see these are people who are giving their lives to serve God. They don't send their children to public school, and they have family. We don't have family planning. It's an average of 6-7 children, and they have, everybody pays for their private tuition. They're people of the book. They study, they learn constantly through the day. They're poor families, and they give their lives for the religion, for the eating kosher and everything that's required. We started charity organizations and hospitals. It's Bikur Cholim. Anybody's a Muslim, a Jew, it doesn't matter. Anybody who needs special food, they'll go and they're in any of the hospitals where around the city of New York and a lot of throughout America, the big hospitals, there are people's bikur cholim. They'll provide for you kosher food, and so on and so forth. These people, and yet you won't find one single Israeli flag in Williamsburg. Go around, it's miles and miles. It goes through to Bed-Stuy already. It goes all because they're spreading because we don't have family planning. Because these are Jews who are true to the Torah and they know what that religion requires. So they refuse to support the occupation. This is a fact. And not only this is this fact that they refuse to support the occupation here, they demonstrate. Not many that demonstrate, with tens of thousands demonstrate, thank God. And we have, again, you can go to our sites, you can see the demonstrations in front of the White House. We're not the York Times. You have 10,000 people or more going. It's not reported in the news, not the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of these. They'll never report this because they have such pressure. Either they're owned by Zionists or pressured by Zionists. And they're right away labeled as anti-Semitic. But the fact is we demonstrate in front of the United Nations, in front of the Israeli embassy in Manhattan, many times through the year. And you have why? Because we're Jews. And because we are Jews, we oppose the state of Israel. Straight, flat out. We oppose the existence of the state of Israel. It's a direct rebellion against God, as been stated by all our rabbinical authorities around the world. Again, Zionists were ostracized. But what did they do? They made a rabbinate. So now you have a dual rabbinate in Israel. You have the rabbinate of the non-Zionists, that's there. And you can go to our communities. They have even Palestinian flags on the walls, painted on the walls because the Zionists ripped them off. We have pictures of those communities. And you can see, it's really beautiful to see how they're existing there. Again, I gather it's not possible to show these pictures, but you can go to our sites, we can see the walls and the carrying Palestinian flags. In fact, it was just 2 weeks ago, I think it was, a whole caravan of Israeli police came in with these big trucks, like utility trucks, and they ripped off they went and they painted over the walls that have Palestinian flags painted in Mea Sha'arim, because these communities are anti-Zionist, but they decided they're not going to stand for it anymore. So they came and they broke it. A rabbi was in my house visiting. This was 2 weeks ago, I think it was. He was visiting in my house, and he got a report that they broke into his house and simply they confiscated the kafirs and where they found flags there. That's what they went. They broke in, he said, like a bunch of them, 30, 40, and then there was demonstrations in the streets, and nobody hears, nobody sees. But this is ongoing. And you go to London, you go to Montreal, Canada, wherever you will find, invariably, the more the religious the community, the more anti-Zionist. If you bother, we go once a year, the Zionists make the parade, the Israeli Independence Day parade in Manhattan on 5th Avenue. Now we have a block where we stand demonstrating, a group of us. If anybody bothers to go there, they'll see, don't go there, but you see pictures of it, but you'll see that you won't find the very religious there marching with them. You always see people, first of all, women singing. It's forbidden for men amongst the Jewish religion to hear women singing. You have women singing, dressed totally immodestly, and everything that breaches the laws of the Torah. And you'll have them, they'll have caravans, and they'll have these modern day schools from Jews. But you won't have all the very religious. And you wonder, this is New York. Where are all the yeshivos, the very religious schools? Why aren't they here? It should seem that if Israel is one of the central themes of Judaism, which it should be, right? Doesn't it make sense of the way the Zionists portrayed it? It's one of the themes. Wherever you go to any event for the Holocaust, you go for an event for any type of thing, a menorah lighting, these Israeli flags, they're always busy with Israel. It seems like it's a central theme of Judaism, right? We were sent into exile, and we have now our land. It's a central theme. We have to fight for it to the death. If that's the central theme, how come the more religious communities don't support it? You don't find them marching and celebrating. Why, if you go to Montreal, where you find the very religious, look for the very religious community, or Bois-Brillant, which is a little town next to Montreal, which is the very religious community, or here Williamsburg, Brooklyn, or you go to London, in Stamford Hills, that's where the very religious, it's very beautiful over there. You have a synagogue, a mosque over there in Stamford Hills. It's beautiful to see. It's for a long, long time it's been like that. And there's no Israeli flags there. There's a reason for this. It's not just it happened like that. The reason is because they are in direct opposition to the existence of the state of Israel, because it's a rebellion against God and because it's anti-Semitic. The state of Israel is our worst enemy. They are the greatest in many facets. I mean, what they're doing simply, the Torah says, do not kill, do not steal, and show your appreciation to a people. They're oppressing the Palestinian people that there's no words to describe what's happening to the Palestinian people. We as Jews, thank God, we've been going for, as after Rabbi Dushinsky passed away, the one who presented to the United Nations that we don't want to stay, then there was another one, they usually hold that position until they pass on. And then there was another chief rabbi, his name was Rabbi Teitelbaum, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum of blessed memory. In fact, there's a community upstate, KJ, and that they're all students, followers of Rabbi Teitelbaum, of course no Israeli flags, and they're the ones who were very vocal, the ones who are his followers, because he kept on insisting that you have to be outspoken and let the world know that it's not Judaism. And he himself was the chief rabbi of Palestine and moved to New York and remained in New York and held court, was the chief rabbi from New York over the whole community of Palestine for many years. How many years was he? 30, 40 years? Like that. He remained with the title as the chief rabbi, and he kept on urging people to leave. Now, many people would be leaving Palestine from the Jewish people. Many people do leave. Constantly people are leaving because they refuse, because it's immoral and it's wrong to be under occupation of a people. But another reason, but many people can't, because we've been involved with this, because it's extremely hard to get visas, and that all of you know, I'm sure, you have some experience with that. It's so for the Jewish people, it's the same thing. It costs fortunes. You get lawyers, it costs fortunes, and they don't have that. So we have a trickle of people coming constantly. But the same thing is with England. They try to settle in England or Montreal. They can't just go to any country somewheres, to somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. They have to go to a place where there's a Jewish community, because we require kosher food, schooling, and everything. It's very hard as a Jewish person to just settle anyways. It has to be done in a community where they have the obligatory issues for Judaism. So they try to come to the, and it's very hard. So many remain there because they have no option. There's others who remain there because simply they have grandparents and uncles and aunts and people who are counting on them to help them. So they're there. So and they don't know another language. There's many reasons. But again, in Palestine, you have in Al-Quds, and in many other areas there in Palestine, that are Jewish communities that are anti-Zionist. Now, why is there not so much of a voice in the world from these Jewish communities? There should be hundreds of thousands demonstrating constantly. But just like they viciously attack all who stands up against them from the non-Jews as being anti-Semitic, the same they do with the Jewish people. They label them as self-hating Jews. They hound them. They harass them. My tires have been slashed. We have in England. I have a rabbi. I mean, they shot at him. None of it has been caught, mind you. They have the very efficient Secret Service, and we have pictures. There's somebody in Manchester, one of our leading spokespeople in Europe, Rabbi Cohen, hundreds of times they've cut his tires. They shot into his house. They have police eyes around his house, and nothing. Nobody gets caught. Nobody. It's just ongoing. So the other people see this from the community, and they're fearful of speaking out. So they're not Zionists. I have many people in New York. Thank God, we have these large. We're more we're more insulated. So we have our own school system. We have our own burial place. We have our everything that's required for a Jew, store and everything. So it's easier for a Jew who is an outspoken anti-Zionist to live. So we have these demonstrations. We go out tens of thousands. But there are people in every state of the United States. There are people throughout Europe and in occupied Palestine, in Jerusalem, wherever you would like. There are hundreds of thousands. They would be out there on the streets demonstrating if it wouldn't be for their fear of the attacks of the Zionists. But that said, we have, thank God, still occasionally hundreds of thousands go out, and tens of thousands certainly, and we have here in New York and so forth, we go out demonstrating. Even we always have delegations of rabbis coming from Palestine, from New York, from other areas, that we always constantly going speaking out to the Palestinians by the United Nations. In fact, we proudly state that we think we were before Muslim people demonstrated in front of the United Nations. We were doing this. The first time we saw a group of Arab or Muslim people speaking up for the Palestinians when they attacked Lebanon. I think that's the first what we remember. Now, not that we're have any bad comments about the Muslims. We understand why, because there's a lot of scrutiny of the people who come out and demonstrate. And we know a lot of people who are thrown out of the United States because they demonstrate. We know that they come with cameras in your face, and the Zionists who come, and people from the government, and people come and they take pictures of everybody who's demonstrating. And people are afraid because a lot of people are immigrants. I'm not an immigrant. It's easy for me to go out there. But there are many people who are immigrants, and they're afraid to be outspoken. There is here in New Jersey, you have Katanani, Imam Katanani, a very close friend of mine, and he was many years already as an imam, a distinguished imam, a very, very special person. And he went demonstrating, and all of a sudden he was caught. He was called down to the and told that he has to leave, and he's been fighting this for years and years. Imagine that, a distinguished leader of the Palestinian people here. It's just unforgivable, such a thing, and this is the fact. So many people see that and they say, "Look, I just can't do it. I can't. I have a family to take care of. I have to, So they don't stand up and speak out. Same thing is with the Jewish people. And I was mentioning, but the first time we saw when Lebanon was attacked by the Zionists, that's when we first saw a group of Muslims coming out by the United Nations, and they looked at us. They saw us demonstrating, and they looked at us very suspiciously. They couldn't figure this thing out. It was before the internet type, all this stuff. So they couldn't. But then eventually, that's how we started demonstrating together. That was the beginning of our standing together and demonstrating. We've been doing this constantly. Thank God. God should give us strength. We'll continue till God, with His mercy, will bring an end of the occupation. But this is the fact, that the Jewish people would be out there in droves if it wouldn't be for the fear of the attacks of the Zionists. But they're there. And again, so the basic is that the religion Judaism has nothing to do with the occupation. It has nothing to do with Zionism. On the contrary, it's contradictory in its essence, because Judaism is subservience to God. Zionism is blasphemy, is rooted in blasphemy, saying that God cannot protect us. God doesn't have the strength, and totally ignoring the words of the Torah, that what we are. It's a national. They would say we're a proud nation. We have gold medal winners. We have they win the Olympic team. They have a special Olympic team and so forth. Whatever, they try to present themselves that we're a nation amongst nations, and we're not a third world country. They're so proud of that. Well, that's not what we're told to be proud of. We're proud to be a servant of God. That's what Judaism is. It's a religion. So in its essence, it's contradictory to what a Jew aspires to be, and what we train our children to grow up to be. They totally wipe that off the map. That has nothing to do with them. They aspire to be some hero, a war hero, or a Nobel Prize winner. That's not what we train our children. That's not what Judaism is. And then, in its fact, being that the fact that they decided to create a state in Palestine, they're breaching all three of the oaths that God, when He sent us into exile 2,000 years ago, they're breaching every single oath. Not to return en masse, in large numbers, not to rebel against nations, the people, the indigenous populace, and not to try to leave exile, because they call themselves, if you look at the Zionist writings, it's called Eschalta de Geula. Eschalta means the beginning, the Geula of redemption. Supposedly, they're the beginning of God's redemption. How revolting to hear that. No, it's not. But that's what they refer to as the beginning of redemption. Even though in front of you, they're flaunting the anti-godliness. They're flaunting the fact that that we have to have, when a person dies, for years already, when a person died, God forbid, in the Holy Land, we would have to have people, special guards, that they should not make autopsies. According to Judaism, the body is holy. Yet they would go and they would they would take bodies and they would cut them up for studying, because they have Nobel Prize winners, and they have to understand the sicknesses and everything. So so we would have to have a guard standing on every body, that they should not cut up the body against the family's wishes. In the United States, it's, thank God, they respect the will of the family. They go and they dig up graves. Why? Because it's antiquity. If you ever heard their emotional advertisement, 2,000 years we're in exile, they play every time why you should support them. And this was the land that God gave us. Even now, when Netanyahu was standing with the president of the deal of the century, What was he saying? You know, that we could go now to the holy sites and so forth. It's the land that God constantly. He's throwing back to the fact that God gave it to us. He's using that psychologically, that it's ours. And that's what he's trying to claim. When the truth is, what is he doing is rebelling against God, against the teaching of the Torah. But they have these holy sites that he talks about that you can go to. He's not telling you that we have people. We have many pictures of that. You can go. We have pictures how they go to graves and they want to study because they know the exact dates of rabbis. So they know the exact date this rabbi would die 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago. So they'll study the body. So they make autopsies. They make the archaeological diggings. And they go to these places constantly, day in and day out. They're digging up graves. Or they decided to build a Kvush 6, a highway, like a main highway, and it goes through a Jewish cemetery. But what do they care? They don't respect the dead. It's part of the basics of Judaism that there's a spiritual, there's a holiness to the sacred, the body. Yet they dig up these graves. They can study it for the archaeological. It's a boon for them, and they have no respect. They build a hotel there. They build a highway. Now I went to Egypt. Egypt made the ring. Maybe you've heard in Egypt they have the. It's called the ring highway. The ring ring road. What? Ring road. It goes around because there's such congestion over there that they decided to make a highway that goes around Cairo. Now, what could they do? There was a tremendously large Jewish cemetery because Jews lived there for hundreds and hundreds of years. So they built it. It cost millions and millions of dollars. They built it over the cemetery that they shouldn't have to disturb the dead. They didn't come and claim that they no respect for the dead. They went, but nobody gives Egypt the credit for what they did. And yet in Israel, they go and they make Kvush 6, their highway, right through a Jewish cemetery, and Jews were beaten, bloodied, rivers of blood fled. You can see that we have pictures of the bones, that they're constantly doing this. They have no respect, yet they tell the world, we're the Jewish state, and don't call it the state of Israel. That's not good enough. The Jewish state. It's so hypocritical that the hypocrisy is till the sky. And if you dare say anything, you're anti-Semitic. But they don't talk about, again, how all the Jews, the religious Jews around the world, the true to the religion, standing there and eating this and demonstrating and frustrated, and we cry with the suffering of the Palestinian people. I'm going to finish there. It's almost 5:30. But with God's help, we have to understand the solution. He came with the deal of the century. Now, we're not accusing him. Again, I'm an American citizen. We have to be respectful to our president and so we plead with him. Do not be duped by or pressured by the Israeli AIPAC and all their power groups, and understand that what you're doing, because let's say that they're many people who really feel the suffering of Jews and they have sympathy with them and they really mean well, or the human rights groups, maybe human rights activists, who they mean well, and we're pleading with the president. This won't be the solution. They went through the Camp David Accord, this accord and that accord and the why, and everything they did. Nothing will be the solution, because it's in the Torah. It says, why are you rebelling against God? It will not be successful. That's what it says in the Torah. Zionism started, they made in 1948, the miraculous state. In 1967, the miracle again, God's miracle, and then it doesn't go 10 years that they don't have this major the setback. And constantly, why? Because they're rebelling against God. Even if they would be successful, it's still not kosher, it's still not halal. But the fact is that they can't be successful, and it's only building anti-Semitism, because people around the world look and they say, this is what Jews are, occupying other people, so it causes bloodshed. So they're the worst anti-Semites, as I was mentioning before. They're exacerbating anti-Semitism around the world. Yet if you dare say something, they say you're anti-Semitic, when they're the ones who exacerbate. If the solution is using logic, first of all, you obey God, because spiritually it'll work. And secondly, because look at history. Jews, before there were any human rights groups, we lived without any special protection. We lived in every Arab and Muslim country in peace. There was never a necessity for that. This is the solution. Remove this impediment to peace that started a mere 100-odd years. It was the impediment. It was the new neighbor to the block, and all of a sudden that's where everybody is getting is allergic to. You see, everybody's starting to sneeze, and they brought that thing in here. So what are you going to look for? Oh, it's this, it's that, it's that. No, what started all the strife and the rift and the hate, the mistrust? This new neighbor, Zionism that came, this nationalism. You didn't have a name for it because there was a lack of knowledge to be able to be able to understand what the problem is. But once we're able to diagnose it properly, like now we have the sickness that's going around, right? And if they can't know what it is, if they can't understand what it is, with corona, what it is, then they can't diagnose it. If they try this, now you know what the diagnosis is. You've been conned. It's not a religious conflict. It's a direct political, pure, materialistic, selfish, flawed political movement called Zionism that was started by a small group of people in Europe that had connections with the British leadership and in the United States. They made the connections, and they're occupying, stifling the voice of the just, of the people that are living there, Palestinian Jews. Let's work to educate and have the world understand that they're being misled, and that they should step out of the box. They should understand that it's nothing to do with a difference of religion. It's because we're not anti-Semites, because we love a Jew, and because we want good for ourselves, us as Jews, that we want to remove this block to peace, the occupation. Remove that, and then we can live together in peace. There will be no problem because of a difference of religion. God should help. It should happen sooner nowadays. And ultimately, we pray for what we do in all our prayers, that God should bring the day when all humanity will recognize the one God and serve Him in harmony. Thank you.